Good evening, everyone. My name is Todd Eberly. I'm a former director of the Center for the Study of Democracy here at St. Mary's College of Maryland. I was called here, unfortunately, the current director, Dr. Antonio Uguez Jr., was called away, but I want to be certain that I acknowledge and thank both Dr. Uguez and his staff for all the work they did to bring together this event tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to open our program by offering an example of how St. Mary's College of Maryland continues to work toward acknowledging important truths about our history. We acknowledge that the land on which we are learning, working, and gathering today is the ancestral home of the Accomaco and Piscataway peoples. We also acknowledge that St. Mary's City was partially built and sustained by enslaved people of African descent. Through this acknowledgement, we recognize these communities and all those who have been displaced and enslaved through colonization. Given the unique importance of the land on which we sit, and given the unique educational mission of St. Mary's College of Maryland as the National Public Honors College, we pledge to continue to unearth and understand these historic realities so that they will inform all of our work. We also pledge to work tirelessly in making our institutions more accessible, inclusive, and equitable, especially for those populations most affected by societal inequities. We do this with the understanding that by supporting and learning from all of our diverse communities, we build a more sustainable future for all. It is my honor to welcome all of you to our special event this evening. The Center for the Study of Democracy is a joint partnership of St. Mary's College of Maryland and historic St. Mary's City, and is proud to be the host of the annual Judge William O. E. Sterling Constitution Day lecture. At the Center for the Study of Democracy, we endeavor to contribute to that effort by offering programs that inform our civic discourse and encourage participation in our democracy. The mission of the center is to explore contemporary and historical issues associated with the ideas of democracy, liberty, and justice in national and international contexts. We seek to facilitate activities that strengthen democracy and the rule of law, enhance security and individual freedoms, invigorate civil society, encourage free enterprise, and increase economic, environmental, educational, and cultural equity. In that light, I am honored to introduce tonight's speaker, Nina Totenberg. You will see in your program that Ms. Totenberg has a long and distinguished career, one that I could not possibly do justice to in a few short words, so I'm not going to try. Tonight, Ms. Totenberg will speak on the Supreme Court and its impact on you, and I know we're all looking forward to her remarks. Just to let you know, after a conversational period between Ms. Totenberg and myself, audience questions will then be entertained at the end of the event. And with that, I ask Ms. Totenberg to please come to the podium.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Todd, President Jordan, everybody else, including the group that just had their beautiful light just destroyed. So I've been asked to give some short opening remarks. And I am going to try to keep them short so that we have as much time as possible for our conversation, Todd, and for a conversation with the audience. As you all know, have covered the Supreme Court for a long time. And I have to say that I have, until now, never covered a court that is anything like this court. And that is largely because it has, with a few exceptions, no center. Every court that I have ever covered, whether it was a liberal-dominated court or a conservative-dominated court, it had several justices, one or certainly more for most of my tenure, justices who were sort of centrist liberals, centrist conservatives, but centrists. And they're really, I would say that probably Chief Justice Roberts comes the closest to that in this, with this court, but those occasions are rare. This is, I think it's fair to say, the most conservative court in about 90 years. Justice Kennedy had a conversation with some of us who cover the court regularly at the time that he was retiring from the court. Just a day after he had announced his retirement, he invited us to have tea with him. And I and others asked him what he thought about some of the decisions that he is very famous for, since his vote was often crucial in deciding cases on abortion, on gay rights, on government overreach, on all kinds of things, on the environment. And he said that he was confident that precedents once established would remain in place. It took just 4 years and one more Trump appointee to basically give the lie to that expectation, or at least to prove him wrong. According to scholarly studies that have been done, this is the most conservative court than at any time since 1931. And you have a court that's moving the goalposts, according to scholars on both the right and left, almost all the time. Whether it's abortion, guns, the regulation of the environment, religion, you name the subject. And this is a court that is making dramatic changes in the law. Conservative and liberal scholars see the court furthermore as unusually aggressive, what one of them called the YOLO court, you only live once. And the court is hardly finished. For example, not this past term, but the term before, when the court overruled Roe versus Wade, the court basically took the position that this was a subject for the states to regulate, and that I think the court actually thought that there would be many states that did allow abortions and many states that didn't, and that was a fairly simple proposition. But it turns out there are all kinds of questions that the court either didn't contemplate or didn't want to contemplate. Can states bar citizens from obtaining FDA-approved abortion pills through the mail? Can they bar interstate travel in order to get an abortion? Can they bar telemedicine appointments with out-of-state doctors? Can they ban information about the availability of abortion in other places? And on and on and on. And this term, we have plenty of action already on that front and others. The court has not yet accepted for review a case testing the ability of the FDA to regulate the abortion pill, which it okayed 20 years ago under many circumstances, and has in the last about 8 years, it's liberalized some of those rules to make abortion pills more available. And all of that has been challenged in the lower courts, in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, where the lower courts have, to varying degrees, sought to overturn the FDA's actions. And the government and Danco Pharmaceuticals have already appealed those decisions to the Supreme Court, And I would expect the court will grant them, and it'll try to hear those cases this term. On guns this term, we have the first of many challenges that we can expect in the wake of the court's very broad decision striking down gun laws. In the particular case in which they did it were to limit who could carry a gun, the kinds of regulations that applied to who could carry a gun. And the court used that case to make a very broad ruling about how the right to bear arms is comparable to the right to free speech. It's part of the Bill of Rights, and you would have to have extraordinary circumstances to justify when you could, in this case, regulate guns. Well, the case that's already been granted for this term is a case that tests the federal and state laws that bar gun purchases for anybody who has a temporary restraining order against them for, usually it's a domestic violence situation. And the plaintiff in this case, Mr. Rahimi, is not what you would call a nice guy. He's a guy with a fairly violent criminal record. So it's going to be interesting to see where the rubber meets the road on this case when it comes to the court. It's going to be argued in November. And we have, early in the term, we're going to have a case that challenges regulation of the financial markets and of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the regulations. If the court agrees with the plaintiffs in this case, the people who are challenging the status of the CFPB, that agency would be, for all practical purposes, probably a dead letter, because the way it's financed is through the Federal Reserve System. And the complaint is that it is not, strictly speaking, subject to the appropriations laws of Congress, or procedures of Congress. Then the CFPB board is authorized by Congress, but the money comes from the Federal Reserve and in turn comes from fees that are paid to the Federal Reserve by banks and other financial institutions. So this is my quick review of what's coming up. And I think I've done it reasonably quickly, so I'm going to sit down and be quiet now.
Thank you for that. You addressed a bit of this in your opening remarks, but you recently commented that every group of 9 Supreme Court justices is different, but that this court is like no other. And one of the things that you had mentioned in your opening comments was the lack of a center. Can you talk more about the role of a center on a court like this, and maybe how it's changed during the time that you've covered it?
Well, when I first started covering the court, which was the first year I covered the court at all, was in the last year of the Warren Court, which was a liberal court after all. But it had a center of, I'd say, anywhere between 3 and 5 people, depending on what the issue was. And if you go back and you read as much as you can of the papers from that period of time, you can see that what they were really trying to do was get to a result that they could, that a critical mass of them could agree to. And that meant that people who were in the middle had a significant role to play. But in this court, often, I wouldn't say all the time, not by any means, but on the biggest cases of the term, the kinds of cases that you all want to read about more than any others, those cases most often have turned out to be 6-3 with 3 of the conservatives who were previously on the court, joined by 3 Trump appointees who are very conservative, and that makes for 6. And the liberals are sort of an afterthought. They have only 3 of them, and there is no center. So unless Chief Justice Roberts and one other member of the conservative majority agree on something to join the liberals, and they did that in 2 significant cases last term, one involving the Voting Rights Act and the other involving what had once been considered something of a fringe claim that only the legislature had the right to make decisions about voting regulations and voting redistricting, and that the state courts had no role to play whatsoever. The state judiciary had no role to play, and that presumably, although this is contrary to what the court has ruled before, that would mean that the governor's veto wouldn't have any role to play, although the court had ruled to the contrary in previous years. Well, the court didn't buy into that. And there is I don't actually remember whether this was 6-3 the other way or 5-4 at the moment, but the court rejected that idea, but left a lot of wiggle room for state legislatures to flex their muscles in the future.
Thank you. I have to ask about the myriad conflict of interest stories regarding Supreme Court justices, whether it's jobs for spouses, real estate deals, extravagant travel. All of it raises serious ethical issues for a branch of government that serves for life and isn't answerable to voters. Can you speak a bit regarding these news stories and the impact that they're likely to have on the court?
Well, I think we've seen the impact both of the Dobbs decision, probably the gun decision too, and these stories. And the court has dropped in its public approval rating significantly. It's now down to well under 50% approval. It's more like 45, 40, 38, depending on the poll you're looking at. And for a court that has no real enforcement power except the trust of the public, that's, to say the least, not a good look. Having said that, I think it's quite clear that the Chief Justice would like to have some sort of a code of ethics, even if it was less than rigorous. But it's now pretty clear he doesn't have a majority of people who agree with him. Now, you can make the argument that you can't have any code of ethics that the court writes for itself unless everyone subscribes to it. But I used to think that, but I think that if it was 7-2 and 2 people were out there in left or right field, you could have an ethics code. But I think it's pretty clear that he would have managed this if it could be managed before now, and that there probably are not 5 people who agree with him that there ought to be one of these, or agree on what kind of a code there ought to be, or they don't want to piss each other off. I mean, I don't sit in their private conferences, but you really can't come to any conclusion other than that at this point, because and at the same time, I want to make very clear that there's a real distinction between what is a serious ethics violation, as in not disclosing major gifts, travel, entertainment, and that kind of thing, which is clearly contemplated by the canons of ethics that are required of all federal judges, that are the federal law. And that law has now been amended by the Judicial Conference to make it even clearer, if it wasn't clear before. And it was pretty clear to all of us. And I think it was clear, for example, to Clarence Thomas, because he disclosed air travel provided by Harlan Crow when he was first on the court. And then there was a lot written about it, and he stopped doing it. So I think originally it was fairly clear to him you were actually supposed to do that. And then he decided it was no longer clear to him. But there's a big difference between that kind of largesse from billionaires. And this is a situation that didn't used to exist in this country. It didn't used to be that billionaires with a political or legal agenda were befriending members of the Supreme Court in an attempt to have them look favorably upon their views. And that just didn't exist. We didn't even have billionaires until relatively recently in large numbers. But now we have those folks on the right and the left. And at least on the right, they have been very active in seeking to ingratiate themselves and their views with members of the court. And some people have been aware of that. Some justices have been aware of that and careful, and others have not. So, and there also is a difference, I think, between some kinds of critiques of the court and other kinds. For example, there was a New York Times piece very critical of Chief Justice Roberts' wife, who makes a great deal of money recruiting for law firms. She has a recruitment firm. Now, this is a woman who had a pretty good legal practice as a lawyer herself when her husband became Chief Justice. And she gave that up and found another way of making money, and it turns out she's very good at it, that she's entitled to do under the Code of Ethics. Spouses are allowed to have their own careers under the Code of Ethics. And that's why for a long time, legal ethics experts were loath to be too critical of Ginny Thomas. She was allowed to have her own political views, for example, and to make money as a consultant on politics. Now, I suspect that most members of the court would not want their spouses to do that, but it was at least arguably permissible. The information that has come out of late is a whole different kettle of fish, but there's not much anybody can do about it. And I think there's a big difference between some of the complaints, even against Justice Alito, who wrote a 4-page memo, essentially. It was styled as an opinion, but it was a memo this past week, saying that he was going to not recuse from a big tax case involving taxes on wealth, the question of taxation of wealth, that he was not going to recuse from that just because he had, what was the reason that that people thought he should recuse? Oh, because one of the lawyers in the case had interviewed him twice for the Wall Street Journal editorial page in a manner that was very friendly to Justice Alito and sort of helped him make his case that he had not done anything unethical. So there is a view that he should have recused himself. But I have to say, the justices are interviewed all the time by friendly reporters and not friendly reporters. And they do public appearances and they answer questions from the public and do interviews like this. And it's very difficult to say that just because this guy interviewed Alito twice in a very friendly manner that helped him get out his message, that Alito then has to recuse from a case in which this guy is one of the lawyers, not the lead lawyer, not the lawyer arguing the case, but one of the lawyers. And when I read that, I thought, you know, it might have been the better part of valor, but on the other hand, you're not supposed to recuse unless you really think you can't be objective. And he obviously thinks he can be objective. And we'll all be able to judge that perhaps in the future.
Speaking of Justice Alito, he also commented that, in his opinion, Congress has no authority to impose ethical standards on the judiciary. They lack that oversight. What are your thoughts on that claim?
Well, the rejoinder to that came from Justice Kagan, who very quickly postulated a very different view, and one that I think is probably the prevailing view, which is that Congress can't do anything it wants to the Supreme Court. It can't, it couldn't, there are all kinds of things that you could imagine Congress could not act. However, the statute that has been on the book for decades governs the ethics of federal judges, including Supreme Court justices. And while not all of it is applied to the Supreme Court every time, because there are only 9 of them, and unlike on the lower courts, nobody can step in when they have to step out. Nonetheless, if you have one share of stock, you must recuse. Whether you're on the district court or the Supreme Court, you must recuse, and nobody has ever challenged that. It's a hard and fast rule. Some of them aren't as hard and fast, but if the court really wants to say that none of the ethical rules that apply to the other 2 branches of government can be imposed on them, they will find their public approval descending yet further. This is not a wise move. In fact, Alito said in that interview, he said, "What I'm about to say is very controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway." And then he said that Congress didn't have any power over the courts. And I thought to myself, the minute you say to yourself as a public figure, this is going to be very controversial, that's the moment when you should pause and say, maybe I shouldn't say it.
Thank you. You have twice made reference to public opinion and public support for the court. Given that the court, as you said, doesn't have the power to enforce its own rulings, all it has is the acceptance of its legitimacy by the people and by the other branches.
Right.
What does the future look like if the court's approval rating, say, enters congressional territory?
That would be really bad for all of us. Really bad. Because the court, I take it from the loud comments I hear or responses I hear from the audience, that this is an audience that is largely not particularly friendly to this court. But I would say to you, this court may be the most conservative court in 90 years, and it may be a court whose opinions you don't particularly agree with, but it is not a MAGA court. It is still a court of law. And when the rubber met the road in the 2020 election, the Supreme Court did the right thing. And when the court was asked whether President Trump, no longer president, could be exempt from subpoenas for things that he did when he was not president, the court was very clear in saying, no, he could not be exempt. So if you really want the court to lose its credibility, the alternative is really frightening, because it means there are no rules, there is no law, and there is no order.
And on that cheery note, can you talk a little bit about how journalism, when it comes to covering the courts, has changed over time, and then maybe what you see as the future of court journalism?
Well, I will agree that those of us who have covered the court for a long time have significant respect for the court. Some of us more than others, and that perhaps in the past we were too deferential to the court. But the kind of reporting that has emerged to cover this court, which is largely focused on its ethics conduct, seems to me to be the height of legitimate oversight by the fourth branch of government, the press corps. I mean, that's what we're supposed to do. Now, I would have to tell you, I don't do a lot of that work because it is very hard investigative work that takes a long time and sometimes a lot of travel and a lot of tracking down people and documents and flight plans and all kinds of things like that. And by and large, that has been done by investigative reporters at ProPublica and Politico. And they are not the people who cover the Supreme Court by and large. They are people who have enough, whose mandate essentially is to go see what they can find out and to spend all the time needed to do that. I don't have the time to do that anymore. I mean, the court is a busy enough place these days, and with an emergency docket that never seems to sleep, so that it used to be a fairly sedate beat. There were maybe a half dozen major cases a term, and then there were B+ cases also, but not that many. And the court rarely granted an emergency request for a stay. It did it twice in the Obama administration, twice in the Bush administration, and was asked to a total of 8 times in those two combined. And in the Trump administration, it did it something like 31 times. And I may be wrong about the 31, but it's close. And that became the norm. And now you see the court, I think even the court is saying, damned if we didn't create a problem for ourselves, because every Tom, Dick, and Harry is coming up here with an emergency request. And even when we deny it, it takes a lot of time on our parts. So,
would you have any advice for college students who might be thinking about a career in journalism or perhaps being part of the news media?
well, it's a great life. You will not get rich, not unless you write a best-selling book, which I was lucky enough to do. And probably some people would not consider that rich, but I got a really good advance. And you will not get rich, but you will have a lot of fun. And there are journalism jobs available today, which there weren't 6 or 7 years ago, because there just weren't a lot of them. Now, a newspaper closes every week in this country. That is probably the biggest danger to democracy today, is that there are no local newspapers, most places anymore, and no one to be looking over the shoulder of the local city council, the mayor, the school board, nobody to poke around any potentials for corruption, conflicts of interest there. And the number of TV stations is also, the number of stations isn't diminishing, but the ownership isn't. The ownership is consolidating. So I am most worried, I think, about that. And, nobody's come up with a model for how to deal with it, but a bunch of organizations have now put forth $500 million towards trying to save local news in this country. And they've asked for lots of, people to submit applications for projects. and NPR will submit some, and so will millions of other people. And I only hope that it doesn't get so fragmented that nothing happens. But that is, I think, if I had to name two things that I think are the biggest threats to democracy, one would be social media, and the other would be the lack of news organizations that people can rely on at the local level.
Thank you. Well said. Please. So I have one last question before I open it up to the audience. I'm imagining during the time that you have covered the courts that you've ruffled a few feathers. And I was just wondering if maybe there's a story you could share with us about maybe a particular set of feathers that were ruffled.
This is what I get for not reading your questions. Well, I did get subpoenaed. And I did refuse to disclose who my sources were for the Anita Hill story. And it did cost NPR. And it did cost NPR about $100,000, which was way less than Floyd Abrams, my wonderful lawyer, could have, and maybe even should have charged, but didn't. And it was, without a doubt, the most unpleasant series of confrontations, because there wasn't just one. There was the legal one, would I testify? Well, I showed up, I didn't tell them anything. And I refused to tell them anything. But there were other confrontations. You know, a famous one I had with Senator Simpson after Nightline, the day after I broke the Anita Hill story, in which he wouldn't let me leave, and in the car that Nightline had sent, and I finally got out of the car and looked up at Al Simpson, who is my friend now, but who I looked up at him, he's 6'7", and I suggested that he commit an unnatural act upon himself. And so, and when I got in the car and left, back in the car and left, the driver drove around the corner, and then he pulled over and he turned around and he said, "Lady, you better get yourself a gun."
Thank you. At this time, what I'd like to open the discussion up to our audience. We have students with microphones on either side of the auditorium. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and someone will get a microphone to you.
And I can't see you, so you're just going to have to speak when they tell you to.
Would you tell us, please, your views about expanding the Supreme Court?
I think it's a nutty idea. And I will quote the late Justice Ginsburg, who said in an interview that she did with me not long before her death, that it was an unreasonable thing to do, because all it would mean is that if you did that, let's say if you added 2 or 3 members to the court, which Congress can do, it's the only thing it can do without passing a constitutional amendment to change the nature of the court. So let's say it did that. And then the next time, let's say the Democratic-controlled House and Senate, if there were the 2 and they could agree on it, they added 2 members of the court. And then the next time there was a president from the Republican Party, if they didn't like what was going on, they could just add 2 more members of the court, and pretty soon you'd have a 25-person court, and it would be doing nothing. It is not a I think, a good solution to the problem that you are seeking to solve.
Hello. We all know that you were very, very good friends with Justice Ginsburg. You just mentioned her name, and of course you wrote the wonderful book that you just wrote about your meals with her in your home. Channeling one of your best friends, I suppose we could say, what would Justice Ginsburg think about three things? I have three questions. What would she feel about the Dobbs decision? How would she react right now to the Clarence Thomas and Alito largesse, the gifts, I guess particularly Clarence Thomas? And would she feel now, given the makeup of the court, the 6-3 makeup of the court, would she feel that perhaps she made an error in not retiring earlier?
Well, let me take the last first. I think undoubtedly she would wish that she had stepped down earlier. But remember that when she declined President Obama's suggestion that she do that, she was at the top of her game. She wasn't sick. She was winning a lot of cases at the Supreme Court that the conservatives didn't think she could get the votes on, and she did. And I don't think that she ever imagined that there would be a Trump-like candidate for president. She thought that Hillary Clinton would win. And she thought that not only that Hillary Clinton would be nominated and would win. And I think she very much wanted to give the first woman president the ability to replace her. Of course, you know, that was years before, that was, I guess, something like 2014 or something like that, when she made that decision. And by the time, or 13, by the time she was sick and was facing a Trump candidacy, there were no such options. So she had to stick it out. And she tried her best. I'm quite confident that she would not have done some of the things that she did to stay alive had she not still been on the court and felt an obligation to try to last it out. And of course, she almost made it. She died, I think, September 20th of 2020. And within a very short time, Joe Biden was elected president. But of course, there still was that time between the nomination and the confirmation that was rammed through a Republican Senate before President Biden actually took office, as did the Democratic-controlled Senate. Now, I don't remember what the other two were. Oh, you know what she'd say about Dobbs. Come on. That's a, you know, she'd be infuriated, but she would have been infuriated in a controlled way. She never burnt bridges that she could, because she always knew she might have to walk back across them. So I think that, you know, I can't really say much more than that, what she would have said about Dobbs. And the other question was about, she would not have said anything publicly about it. I'm quite confident of that.
So it looks like the Supreme Court may decide whether Trump is even going to be on the ballot for this next election. What are your feelings about how that's going to go?
I think it's a really long shot. I don't think that it's going to, I think there's every likelihood that it will fail in the lower courts and that the Supreme Court may not have to touch it, and that would be fine with them.
Hello. As a student, I'd like to learn just basically how you act as a journalist. And I think one of the most important things about that is controlling your bias. Is there anything you'd like to say on how you've been able to keep that controlled?
You know, if I had wanted to be a causist, I would have done that. I don't want to do that. I think my ideas are at least reasonably thoughtful, but I wouldn't peddle them. I never even wanted to be a columnist. I wanted to report the news. There may be some times when I've said something that perhaps I ought not have, although I'm pretty careful in my old age. I wasn't as careful when I was a young reporter because I didn't really know any better. And I really try to use, I'm painfully aware of the kinds of language that indicates what I think. And most of the time, the temptation to do that is one that's not that difficult to resist.
Can you talk about term limits for Supreme Court and your thoughts about the book bans that are going on, the takeovers of the school boards, et cetera?
Well, I don't want to talk about the takeovers of the school board, if that's what it is. It is also people voicing their opinions, thinking that their elected school boards have not done what they wanted, and turning out in sufficient numbers for elections to prevail. And that is democracy, whether you like it or not. It is the job of the courts to then say when a school board does something that really does infringe on people's First Amendment rights, for example. And it's a lot easier to make that argument in a public library than in a school library. But because the school library obviously does make a lot of choices about what is going to be there. And the public has some ability to have input into that. Parents aren't non-entities. And so, you know, I don't really want to go further than that, I guess.
What are you most hopeful about right now? Because participating or like listening to the media and to the news stories, it can be hard to stay hopeful. So what are you hopeful about?
I agree, it can be very, very difficult because bad news always takes precedence, and there's a lot of it, not just in this country, but even worse around the world, and some of it's nobody's fault. You know, a terrible earthquake, a horrible flood. That's nobody's fault. It's just a terrible story, and people are partly hypnotized and partly repulsed by it. But we can't just ignore what's going on. And I guess I should confess to a certain amount of the way I handle some of this. I read 2 newspapers every day. And in both of them, or at least in the Washington Post, I turn to the style and the sports page first. After I read the front page, that's where I go. In fact, I sometimes have to wrestle my husband for the sports page because it's the best writing in the newspaper besides everything else. So, you know, you have to sort of pick and choose. My husband has found some site online that's called Good News, and he reads that once a day or something like that. I don't know. But if you find it indigestible at some point, you stop. And then you just look at the headlines. But on the other hand, you get the country you deserve. And if you don't participate, you've abdicated a lot. And the
I think we have time for one more question.
Someone asked about the term limits and what your thoughts about that.
Oh, the term limits for the court? I have to confess, it's not an insane idea by any means, but I can't, and I've read how this is supposedly would work out, but certainly we would not, even you young people, would probably not live to see the day that it was actually working the way it's intended. That is, that every administration gets a chance that it would be rotating and that there were not, the last Chief Justice appointed by a Democratic president was Fred Vinson in the 1940s. So, on the other hand, of course, FDR appointed all 9 of the justices by the time he died in office. So but I don't think it's an insane idea, but it is going to be, I don't think you can do it without a constitutional amendment. That means you would have to get 2/3 of the House and Senate and 3/4 of the states. And given where we are in this country, I do not see that happening.
Do you have any closing thoughts for us as we wind things down tonight?
No. Except, thank you for having me.
Before you go, I have to have a commercial. I wanted to make everybody aware that the 2023 Benjamin Bradley Distinguished Lecture in Journalism will be presented by award-winning journalist and scholar Jelani Cobb. The program is free and open to the public on October 25th. Please check out the St. Mary's College website for more details. And Nina, thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you.